Hello there and welcome to my Divinity Original Sins 2 guide to create characters. I know that there are a couple of other guides out there, but after really looking through them, I wasn't 100% satisfied with how they are done, mainly because they are mostly not explaining the idea behind a character creation. And the two main questions that most of you asked were either what's the best party setup or how should I create my character? And the way I want to approach it is I will put up a couple of videos. I will keep them brief and short. The first video is tackling character creation in general, and then I will do one video each for all of the skills. So for those of you who want to dive deeper into one of the skills, can just watch that content. And lastly, I would do one video targeting mainly the question, which is the strongest party? What's the strongest build composition that I can go for? Because that's being asked often as well, and I do have a couple of opinions there. I have played the game quite significantly, finished it on honor mode, finished it on tactician, finished it almost on honor mode plus, which is basically honor mode with twice the amount of enemies. So my experience is based on first-hand knowledge of the game, and let's jump right into it. I think Divinity Original Sins 2 is a wonderful game when it comes to character creation. Unfortunately, it does a terrible, terrible job in explaining what works in the game and what doesn't work. So first and foremost, before we go in, I'd like you to understand that in Divinity Original Sins there are several builds that are simply better than others. The balancing in between the different abilities is not necessarily super well developed. They will hopefully patch that in the future. And secondly, I'd like you to understand that there is really no right or wrong answer about which build you'd like to take. So with that being said, I'd like to go into only the main decisions that you usually need to take in order to go for a character. So if you want to go for a character, you basically have four different races. Dwarfs, elven, humans, and lizards, and you have the undead variant of them. Without going too deep into the idea behind it, for beginners, I would not recommend going undead. There are a lot of disadvantages for it, and specifically if you start with a four-man party, just to do yourself a favor and go with the standard race. You can go with the origin basic characters. You will get a lot of the storyline. If you want to know, races usually do not have such a large influence. The standard character or the custom character will always gain the Dome of Protection ability, which in my perspective is the strongest of the starting source abilities, so that is wonderful. If you want to play a DPS character of some sort, go for an elf, because Flesh Sacrifice is probably by far the best ability. If you want to go more for a tank or someone who needs to take a beating, I would go with dwarfs if I'd be you, because the sturdy ability just gives you a little bit more survivability. Other than that, just ignore the race. It is not important. The important part starts when you go onto the build itself. So first thing first, we need to select attributes, we need to select abilities, and we need to select skills. The important parts about the build will be in the upper two sections. I'll cover skills in the deep dive videos, so we're not going to go through that all too much in detail. Attributes basically are your physical attributes that determine how your character is being built. And the real important part for you to know is each of the characters will be mainly based on either intelligence or finesse or strength, or none of them. So these three abilities here are basically your damaging abilities. If you play a strength-based character, any form of melee character, that is your main attribute. If you play any sort of either rogue or archer or finesse-based character, this is your main stat, because damage in this game is king. Likewise, if you go for a pure caster, intelligence is probably going to be the number one stat. I said there's also the option that you skill none of that. There are builds, specifically if you go into summoning, combined with polymorph, that do not scale with any of these abilities. So in this case, your main stat will probably constitution with a little bit focus on memory. So the first three, basically make up your decision and select one of these, which will determine your character. Again, strengths, melee characters, specifically one hand, two hand, um, finesse, basically rogues and archers, and intelligence, pure casters. Now, towards the other sets and how do you distribute it? Basically, my recommendation would be to put 2 points in strengths for all of the characters over the development of the character, because that's the minimum requirement for them to wear strengths-based armor. Put 2 points in constitution, because that's the minimum requirement to wear shields. That is required for melee characters, and that is required for casters. You can ignore it if you are going with an archer build. Shields are extremely good in this game, so 2 points here, 2 points here, and the rest into your main attribute is kind of the normal setup for the first couple of levels. Once you have maxed out your main attribute, kind of can start to splice in a couple of points here and there. I would recommend memory. I'm personally a big fan of it because it gives you a larger amount of skills at your disposal. I would leave the attribute selection with that. Just keep the easy rule of thumb. The reason why I want to keep it easy is there can be a significant amount of discussion from build to build to decide how you want to distribute your stats. If you follow my rule of thumb, you will end up with a near optimal distribution anyways. Secondly, the abilities, also called skills or your focus area. In order to go through the skills, I want you to understand that skills have primary and secondary abilities, and that some skills are extremely strong for their secondary ability and therefore almost always mandatory in certain builds. Okay, secondary abilities for skills mean you're not actually using the skills out of the school, which the ability which the skill unlocks. Secondary abilities are a passive bonus that will help you. So when you now take a look at the skills, let's look at the prime examples for typical builds that you would want to go. If we're talking about you going into a physical role, the strongest physical build is a two-hand weapon build. So in that case, you would go with warfare and start maxing warfare first. The reason why that is the case is warfare, in contrast to any other skill that we talk later about, specifically the weapon skills, is having a multiplicatory effect instead of an additory effect. So in simple words, whilst skilling two-handed weapon will add a fixed amount, this here will add a multiplicatory value that is just escalating the damage faster and will be more viable. So 10 points in warfare whenever you do have a physical based build. Now, interestingly enough, warfare, besides being like the main physical build for martial characters that are frontliners, also has the single best secondary ability, because every single point there increases your physical damage by 5%. So any build that is an archer, any build that is a scoundrel, so rogue, and even any build that is a necromancer, which is the only caster that scales with physical damage, is going to max 10 points into warfare, because it simply means you deal 50% more damage. Voila. There right away, pro tip number one. If you want to build physical, this is going to be your number one skill in many of the builds. Now, if you want to build an archer, huntsman is a wonderful start. Go 2 points into huntsman and then focus on 10 points warfare. If you want to build a scoundrel, like a two-handed weapon rogue, go 2 points into scoundrel and afterwards 10 points into warfare. I think you get the point of how the builds on physical damage work. Now, secondly, if you want to build a caster, pure caster build, both hydromancy and pyromancy are quote-unquote offensive schools. They do have some of the strongest offensive spells. Pyromancy definitely more than Hydromancy, but both of them are very much recommended to skill fully into it. Now here's the kicker to the whole story. Contrary to many other RPGs, you don't need many points within either of them in order to get some of the skills. So many of the casters would probably take 2 or maybe even 3 schools and just put in 2 points into these schools to get a lot of the utility out of the schools. Specifically, Hydromancy, and we'll go through that in detail in the individual videos. Specifically, Hydromancy and Geomancy have a lot of wonderful utility. Also, Aerotherk has absolutely phenomenal spells for utility. If you want to play a caster, go to either maxing Pyro or Hydro. Use the respective other supporting skills. Hydro works pretty well with Aero. Pyro works pretty well with Geomancy. There's also nothing wrong with always skilling Hydro and Geo as kind of supporting skills, and then going into either maximizing Hydro or Pyro, or even going Aerotherk. In all of the cases, at the end, you should have 2 points in at least 2 of the schools, maybe 3, and you should maximize one of the schools, because the schools themselves scale quite well when you want to deal damage. Now, the only caster exception there is the Necromancer. I told about that already. The Necromancer himself is the only caster who uses int as his main stat, but still deals physical damage. Therefore, if you want to go with a Necromancer, 2 points here, and then fully go for Warfare. All of the so full stop. Now let's look at the secondary skills. I already started with Warfare a little bit, and I want to just give you some idea of what typical skills are that complement your build. Number 1 was Warfare, which we already went through. Absolutely phenomenal secondary skill. You should definitely have it if you're using a physical build. Number 2, Huntsman. There's a lot of high ground in the game. If you are on high ground, it's another escalating multiplier. If you run with any form of range DPS, an archer or a caster, ironically enough, Huntsman is a very, very good skill. Thirdly, critical multiplier with Scoundrel. Scoundrel can be wonderfully combined with any of these. And you can already see how the synergy is going. Like when you have a two-handed weapon and you go with Warfare and Scoundrel, you not only get the critical multiplier, but you also get all of the damage from Warfare. So Scoundrel, mainly a support ability for melees, but can be also very, very good if you go with casting with casters, because casters have long cooldowns in this game, so sometimes 4 to 5 rounds, which means if you want to cast, you must crit for the highest amount of damage to make the cast worthwhile. So Warfare physical, Huntsman for ranged, and Scoundrel for either casters or melee characters. One of the abilities that I personally like a lot is Polymorph, which provides a free attribute point. Very, very strong. Polymorph is one of 2 abilities that does not have a direct attribute associated with it. So Polymorph fits into almost any build. It gives a shit ton of utility function. It gives a lot of wonderful crowd control. Plus, it provides a wonderful passive ability as well. So Polymorph, highly, highly recommended. As for the weapons themselves, kind of self-explanatory. If you want to go with a two-hand weapon, you start skilling two-handed once your warfare is maximized. If you want to go with a bow, once your huntsman and warfare is maximized, you start going with range. And if you go Scoundrel, you start doing this. Single-handed, quite honestly, is not really good. So like a dual wielder, single-handed character is simply not meta in this game. And I already explained that certain things are way better than others. One thing worth mentioning, the defensive skills usually are underperforming a little bit. I know many of you will probably now go ballistic and say Retribution is wonderful for a tank. Personally, underperformance means they are weaker than other builds. The only thing that stands out here is leadership. Leadership is a perfect ability on your tank. You need to know in this game the enemies, so the AI is programmed as to target the most likely target that they can affect with their spells. Leadership will give everyone else, except the guy who has leadership, a cumulative dodging bonus and the bonus to all resistances, which means basically if your tank has leadership, everyone else is less likely to be affected as long as he stands there. And we can talk about that when we go through builds. As for civil abilities, I will keep it very simple. All of them are nice. They have certain advantages and disadvantages. There's one and one only that is outstanding, which is thievery. Thievery in this game is absolutely broken. It is insanely good. If you do have two characters, 1 to 2 characters that are specialized on thievery, you will not have any money problems whatsoever. It makes bartering, yeah, unless you're glitching, it makes bartering pointless or not necessary. The lore master ability is quite nice if you want to identify your items as well yourself. So if you have a well-rounded team with 4 players, I would go with thievery, 1 lore master and 1 whatever you like. Persuasion sometimes for some of the quest skills. But again, that is really the only thing you need to know here is thievery. Good. Last but not least, we'll go through the talents real quick. There are a couple of talents that typically are mentioned specifically on many of the builds as to be outstandingly good. I'll start first and foremost with a couple of the abilities that DPS characters often use, and then we'll go to kind of niche abilities or abilities that are very strong if you want to reach a certain target. Ability number 1, Executioner, ironically enough goes along with Warfare. Probably one of the strongest, if not the strongest talent. Whenever you kill someone, you gain 2 action points. 2 action points are extremely strong. It is almost the difference for a normal party, it's half of your turn from one character. So if you can get your hand on Executioner, that is really worthwhile. Another wonderful ability that you need to know, so Executioner kind of works for every character that is dealing damage. Second ability that works for every character that is casting is Elemental Affinity. Very strong, reduces the action point cost, and you can already see kind of the idea where this is going, either less action points or more damage. The third ability that I highly recommend is Far Out Man for casters, because it just increases your reach. If you position well, Hot Hat is a great ability because it gives you an cumulative crit chance and accuracy, which for specifically the physical characters is a really good trait. And last but not least, Savage Sortilege, which gives your casting spells the option to crit, which, as I explained earlier, is something that you definitely would want to do. So these are the skills that I would recommend as offensive skills. Now let's come to defensive skills. If you have a lot of points in Warfare, Picture of Health with a cumulative 3% vitality is very good. The by large and far best talent in the from a defensive standpoint, specifically on higher difficulties, is Comeback Hit. Comeback Hit lets you ignore the first lethal strike. It is wonderful later in the game. If you do have the reviving idols, which automatically revive you, this here will reset the cooldown for the revive. So this plus the idol means you effectively can take 3 lethal hits without being out of the game, which is really good. So that's probably the strongest defensive talent. Not a big fan of Morning Person because it becomes redundant once you have the idols. I am, however, a fan of any form of living armor. I am a fan of Padpaw because it's a talent that offers you a lot more experience if you can talk to the creatures. And last but not least, I'm a fan of Duck Duck Goose and Elemental Ranger, one being a little bit more for damage, and Duck Duck Goose for range characters to not take attacks of opportunity. Also not bad if you go into one point of Scoundrel, the pawn, but it is kind of mutually exclusive with Executioner. Pawn lets you basically move one ability point worth as a free movement, which is okay, but Executioner by far is better. That's my personal take on it. Do whatever you want with the talents. These are the ones that I would recommend you to take. They worked wonderful and they are like all around strong. That concludes our first visit for the characters. Next up, I'll go through all of the skill schools in detail, and then finally I'll close up with what are the strongest builds at the moment from my perspective, and we'll give you an insight. Let me know what you think if that was helpful. Plus, what your opinion on the skills is. Just write a comment below, and see you in the next videos.